Algebra 2, Concept 48, Sampling Methods. We're going to start out these notes a little different. So look on your notes packet where it says exploration. You're going to try just to figure these things out before we take any notes. So the goal of any statistical study is to collect data and then use the data to make a decision. Any decision that you make using the results of a statistical study is only as reliable as the process used to obtain the data. So if the process is flawed, then the resulting decision is questionable. So here we're going to analyze some sampling techniques. See if you can determine whether each sample described below would be representative of the population. So do that on your own for A, B, C, and D. Determine whether, yes, it would be a good representation, or no, it would not, and then explain why it wouldn't. So pause the video and do that, and then check back and compare and see how you did with the answers that I have up on the screen. So in the first one, I said no, that this would not be a good representative sample. So to determine the number of hours people exercise during the week, researchers use random digit dialing and they call 1,500 people. Well, for one, people may not answer. People might not have a phone. Also, some people may be exercising rather than answering the phone. So on B, I also said no, this would not be a good representative sample. To determine how many text messages high school students send in a week, researchers post a survey on a website and receive 750 responses. So you might have people that don't have internet and then they can't be surveyed. On C, I also said that this would not be a good representative sample. To determine how much money college students spend on clothes each semester, a researcher surveys 450 college students as they leave the university library. Well, that only gives you the sample of those students who are in the library. So if you're not in the library, you won't be surveyed. So it's not a good representation of all the college students. And then finally, I also said no, this would not be a good representation. To determine the quality of service customers receive, an airline sends an email survey to each customer after the completion of a flight. Because with this, only those who choose to respond are surveyed. Now look at the next part of the exploration. So this is analyzing survey questions. See if you can determine, just using your common sense, whether each survey question is biased. If something is biased, that means that it has some kind of error that causes a misrepresentation. Maybe it's the wording that would cause you to think of a situation in a certain way, or maybe it's a language that's used that only some part of the population would know. Explain your reasoning if you think something is biased or not. If you do think it's biased, suggest an unbiased way to reword the question. So a way that would clear it up, that would make it explanatory to people who are reading it. So, does eating nutritious whole grain foods improve your health? Well, I said that yes. I think this is biased because it encourages a yes response. What about saying, what effect does eating whole grain, etc. foods have on your health? So because of some of those words, nutritious and then improving, it is suggesting or encouraging a yes response. On B, I also said yes, that this is biased. Do you ever attempt the dangerous activity of texting while driving? So right away, that question causes the reader to think of texting in a certain way. So it encourages a no response, because who wants to be, involved in dangerous activity? So maybe something that would leave that out. A question like, do you ever text while driving? On C, how many hours do you sleep each night? I said that this is fine. It's very simple. It doesn't imply one way or another if sleeping more or less is good or bad. And on D, I said that this had bias because it says, how can the mayor of your city improve his or her public image? So using the word improve implies that the mayor needs to improve. So it would bias the reader to give a suggestion in that. Something that would be unbiased might be, how would you describe the mayor's public image? And that would just leave it open for the person to respond whether the image is positive or negative. So hopefully those little exploration questions gave you an idea of what we're going to be talking about in this concept. Now go up to your vocabulary definitions and formulas and let's get some vocabulary down. So you may need to pause the video so you can get these definitions as I talk through them. So we're talking about when you're researching a population and we're going to choose a sample. We learned about that in the last concept. So a sample is a subset of your population. A random sample would be a group where each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. And that is a good type of sample to have when you're trying to find out information about a population. One type of sample you can have is called a self-selected sample. So members of a population can volunteer. You can also have a systematic sample. So a rule is used to select members. So if you look at this little graphic, you can see that certain ones are grayed out and then certain ones are in color there. So some kind of rule has been used to select those members. You can also have what's called a stratified sample. So groups are formed by similar characteristics, then the sample is randomly selected from each group. You can have a convenient sample where members of a population are surveyed or talked to who are easy to reach. And then finally a cluster sample. So the population is divided into groups called clusters, and then all the members of that one cluster are selected. So these are just different ways that you can create a sample of a population. So look at example 1. Let's say that you want to determine whether students in your school like the new design of the school's website. Identify the type of sample that's being described, so the type of subset from this population. So the first one says, you list all the students alphabetically, and choose every 6th student. Well, do you see how there's a system to that? So you're listing them all alphabetically and then every 6 students. So this is what we call a systematic sample. So there is a method to your madness. So systematic sample. And that's because there's a rule used. All right, you mail questionnaires and use only the questionnaires that are returned. So in this, yes, you're sending out the questionnaires, but people choose whether or not. So in this case, people are volunteering their answers. So this is a self-selected sample. And that's because they are choosing to respond, volunteering to do that questionnaire. And then finally, you ask all of the students in your algebra class. And we have D there as well. So let's just stop. All the students in your algebra class. I would say, a convenience sample. And then finally, you randomly select 2 students from each classroom. So we've got that stratified sample. So the population is divided into smaller groups, and then a sample is chosen from each group. So randomly 2 students. Oops. So we'll call that a stratified sample. Now right now we're not making judgments as to which sample we think would give us the best view of that population. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But that's something as you as a researcher are creating your sample that you want to think about. What would give me the best representation of this population that I'm trying to study? Go back up to your definitions now and let's get a few more down. So bias. I mentioned this earlier in the exploration. Bias is an error that causes misrepresentation of a population. So if you have bias in your sample of that population, then you would misrepresent it. Or if you had bias in a question, that's the second definition there. A biased question is a flawed question that leads to inaccurate results. So it gives people a suggestion, kind of in whether it's wording, positive or negative, of how they should respond. And then sometimes it just uses words or information that some people in your sample may simply not know. See how you do recognizing bias in sampling in example 2. So let's identify the type of sample and then explain why the sample is biased. So you're going to know that it's biased. So we have a news organization, and it asks its viewers to participate in an online poll about bullying. So first of all, the viewers are asked to participate, so that means that they can choose whether they want to participate or not. So that would be a self-selected sample. Get my pen to work here. All right, so it's self-selected. Now let's talk about why this bias or sample might be biased. Well, if you're talking about bullying, oftentimes people have very strong feelings when it comes to bullying, and oftentimes it's because they have been bullied. So if you're asking people to respond about this, that you probably would get responders who feel strongly about bullying and just not a good general representation about how the viewers of this new organization or news organization feels about bullying. So I would say the bias is that because the responders, they probably have some kind of agenda. They feel strongly about it. So most likely they've been bullied, or they could be bulliers that feel like, have opinions about people that complain about them. So just allowing that responders to self-select, that doesn't just, again, give a good representation. So a computer science teacher wants to know how many students at a school most often access the internet. So the teacher asks students in one of the computer science classes. Okay, so let's talk about, this is a convenient sample, I think, because they're all just there in that computer class. And then this group would not be a good representation of students at the entire school because, for one, they're just in one particular class, but it's in a computer science class. So you're going to have students that, make sure that they can access the internet. And other students in the school can't give feedback. So it eliminates the responses from the other students. Now, if the researcher just wanted to know about students in the computer science class, then this would be a good representation. But since it wants to know in the school, you would want to sample students from other classes as well. I'm going to talk you through how to select an unbiased sample. So you're a member of your school's yearbook committee. You want to poll members of the senior class to find out what the theme of the yearbook should be. There are 246 students in the senior class. Describe a method for selecting a random sample of 50 seniors to poll. Well, you could simply, I'm just kind of a numbers person, so you could assign each senior a different number from 1 to 246. So maybe you have a list. So assign each senior a number. It doesn't mean you're going to go and give them the number from your list. You just assign them a number from 1 to 246. Then you want to use a random number generator to get 50 numbers, which would correspond to 50 students. Now, notice I didn't say choose, just randomly ask somebody to choose 50 numbers, because when we as humans pick numbers, it's not a good random selection. Usually, even though we're not thinking about it, there's some kind of method to what we're doing. So use a random number generator. Nowadays, you can simply go online. If you have some types of calculators have programs in them that will randomly give you different numbers. You can give them a range, like you want 50 random numbers from 1 to 246. But the easiest way is just simply to go online and Google random number generator, and you'll be able to tell what values from what to what, and then how many random numbers you would like. Let's do one more group of vocabulary and definitions. So go back to that section in your notes. Now we're going to talk about different types of ways that we can study these samples, these subsets of the population. So you can do an experiment, which is where you have a certain treatment on individuals to collect data. You can conduct an observational study where you simply observe individuals and measure variables without controlling the individuals or the environment. You're just observing. You can give a survey, which is an investigation of one or more characteristics of a population using questions. You can also hold a simulation, which uses a model to reproduce conditions of a situation or process. And depending on what you're studying, one of these types may be better or worse than the other. So based on those definitions, look at example 4, and let's try to identify the different methods of data collection. So a researcher records whether people at a gas station use hand sanitizer. So I can imagine this person just kind of, I don't know how they would see that, but that would be an observational study. They're not suggesting or handing them hand sanitizer. It's probably right there, but they are simply observing. So it's an observational study. A landscaper fertilizes 20 lawns with a regular fertilizer mix and 20 lawns with a new organic fertilizer. The landscaper then compares the lawns after 10 weeks and determines which fertilizer is better. So in this case, we have some kind of treatment going on. This is an experiment. You have a treatment on some lawns with this new fertilizer. So, I'm just going to write treatment. This is an experiment. So some of the subjects are given a different treatment than others. Members of a student council at your school ask every 8th student who enters the cafeteria whether they like the snacks in the school's vending machines. So this is a survey. We're just asking people to respond to questions. A park ranger measures and records the heights of trees in a park as they grow. Observational. So the park ranger is not doing any kind of treatment on these trees. And then finally, a researcher uses a computer program to help determine how fast an influenza virus might spread within a city. So this is a simulation. It's created this computer program that's going to simulate the spread of the disease. Now try your hand at recognizing bias in survey questions. So when designing a survey, it's important to word survey questions so that they don't lead to any kind of certain results. Answers to poorly worded questions may not accurately reflect the opinions or actions of those being surveyed. Questions that are flawed in a way that leads to inaccurate results, those are called biased questions. So you want to avoid questions that encourage a particular response, do not provide enough information to give an accurate opinion, are too sensitive to answer truthfully, or address more than one issue. So look at example 5. we're going to identify and then correct the bias in this survey question. So a dentist surveys his patients by asking, do you brush your teeth at least twice per day and floss every day? Well, if that were me, right away I would be thinking, oh, my dentist wants me to be brushing my teeth at least twice per day and flossing every day. So I would feel like there's some kind of positive or expected answer there. So the bias that I would say is that it just implies how you should brush and floss your teeth. Like the frequency and the fact that you should be doing it. Implies how to brush and floss teeth. So a question that doesn't lead, someone to a certain response might be something more like, describe your dental hygiene routine. I think the only thing that implies is that hopefully you have one. But as far as a dentist trying to get information, that would be a fairly neutral way to do it. So describe your dental hygiene routine. Let's look at this next survey question. Do you agree that our school cafeteria should switch to a healthier menu? Well, that does definitely have some bias in the question. Because of the wording, it's implying that the menu needs to be healthier. It encourages a yes response. Yes, of course, we should have a healthier menu. So you want to have a question that is worded in such a way that it's not going to lead people one way or another. So maybe just a yes or no question. Should the school cafeteria switch to a healthier menu? You could probably argue with me that that might also introduce bias, because I'm still using the word healthier, that description. So, should the school cafeteria... Can you think of a more neutral way to say that? To a healthier menu. What about, should the school cafeteria change its menu? Now, you might get lots of responses in that case. That would be what you're not looking for. Like, responses that for saying, yes, it should offer sushi or something that's not feasible for the school. But again, it might be the best way to have an unbiased response. So, should the cafeteria switch its menu? Or change, I think I would use change. For some final practice, do the teacher talk questions, pause the video, and then come back and to check your responses with my responses. So in number 1, that's a self-selected group. Number 2, that is a systematic sample, and its bias is that it encourages a yes in favor of lower taxes. And finally, in number 3, we have a systematic sample, and it's unbiased in its representation. It would be a good representation of those passengers. And then finally, number 4, this is a sensitive question, and so it would introduce bias. People would probably not be comfortable answering it directly, so it would probably be better asked anonymously.